Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. In the final part of our conversation with research psychologist Dr. Jesse James, we're going to talk about the questions you should ask your polygamy skeptic friends. He's got a bunch of them, so you might want to take notes. Check out our conversation.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about was that there are certain questions that that people suggest that you should ask when you're evaluating the validity of a conspiracy theory. So these are questions that any of us can ask. We don't have to be an expert. We don't have to be a historian in order to evaluate the evidence. We just need to ask certain questions of ourselves. So one question is this idea of source credibility. We've kind of addressed that already, so I'll skip that. Another one is the evidence of the evidence and proof. So you have to ask, like, what evidence is provided? How accurate is the evidence that's invoked in that theory? And what counter evidence exists? So if we look at the mainstream conspiracy theory field, we see like the moon landing as an example. Since the 2000s, high definition photos have been taken from satellites around the moon and observed the footprints where the astronauts walked, the descent stages that were left behind, the parts of the modules that were left behind that they used to launch off and separated. Those are left on the surface of the moon, and the extant flags stuck in the ground. If high photograph images have been taken of these things,
those are just fake too.
Yeah, there's further evidence of the conspiracy, right? But if that kind of evidence exists, then you have to say that counter evidence to the conspiracy theory negates the possibility of the conspiracy theory, right? Well, there's no direct evidence.
The Earth is flat.
There's no direct evidence of Brigham Young trying to cover up a conspiracy. But there is direct evidence of Joseph III trying to cover up his father's involvement. Like, for example, he writes a letter to William Smith where he says, basically, be careful what you say, William. I don't want this getting out. I don't want you talking about this. Please, keep it to a minimum. I don't want you talking about my dad being involved in polygamy, right? That is evidence of a conspiracy, of trying to cover up the truth of Joseph's involvement in polygamy.
An RLDS conspiracy.
Yes, exactly, an RLDS conspiracy. There is no similar evidence, and you might expect it. If, for example, Brigham were trying to orchestrate a conspiracy, you might expect to find letters or minutes where Brigham instructed people to stick to his narrative. You might expect defectors in Nauvoo to implicate Brigham or the 12 instead of Joseph. Right? If that's really who introduced them to polygamy, you would not expect them to say, Joseph came to me. You'd say, Brigham came to me, right? Which I guess Martha Brotherton does. So, but she also says Joseph came later after Brigham. But you might expect also defectors to say Brigham tried to strong arm them into lying about Joseph's involvement.
Like William Marks?
Yeah. So, if you don't see any of these kinds of pieces of evidence, then you have to say, if there's no evidence of a conspiracy, then that's a serious hit to the conspiracy theory argument, right? You'd expect, if you look into it, to find some evidence of conspiracy. It's not a guarantee that you'll find some, but oftentimes when investigative journalists or scientists look into a conspiracy theory, they will discover evidence if it's a legitimate conspiracy. Conspiracy theories often misinterpret evidence or over-extrapolate from limited evidence. So, if you think about the autism-causing vaccine conspiracy theory, this is based on a paper by Andrew Wakefield back in the late 90s. And of course, this there was some original data that seemed to suggest there was a connection between autism,
data.
But it was faked. It was fabricated, right? And so the problem was it was a small sample size, no control group, manipulated data, and eventually the paper was retracted. But once that happened, people, the damage was done. People already believed in it, and they felt like the retraction of the paper was further evidence of the conspiracy, right? So this is, again, this rampant confirmation bias that people will engage in to support their preconceived notions. So we see similar issues with D&C 132 in the Brigham Young conspiracy theory narrative, where they'll point to so many skeptics will point to red herrings and tangential issues that aren't really related to Joseph's involvement. It's like distractions, right? So, for example, in D&C 132, it says, God commanded Abraham to take a second wife, but the Bible contradicts that. So the revelation must be fabricated, right? Isaac also...
That's a theological argument, right?
It is a theological argument. And it's a red herring because it has nothing to do with Joseph's involvement. It presupposes that the only way that this revelation would have a mistake in it, a factual mistake, is if Joseph didn't write it because Joseph was infallible. That's not even LDS theology. We don't believe in infallible prophets, right? So Joseph could have made a mistake, a theological mistake even, in a revelation. He might have later corrected it, but he didn't live long enough, right? But the other thing is, Isaac is listed among the polygamists in D&C 132. It says, how did you allow your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to engage in polygamy? But Isaac in the Bible isn't a polygamist. Only Abraham and Jacob are, right? Mm-hmm. And so people will point to that and say, Joseph wouldn't have made a mistake like that either. Well, I mean, again, it just presupposes that Joseph was unable to make a mistake, that he was, an infallible prophet. But tangential arguments like that are consistently used in conspiracy theories to raise doubt about whatever the standard explanation is, without clearly arguing for some kind of coherent alternative. So the point is like, hey, you have a traditional narrative. We're just going to break that down as much as we can, but we're not going to offer a plausible alternative in its place. This goes back to the point that I was earlier making, that I had to search so hard and work so hard to create an alternative narrative for this podcast so that I could kind of like make this make sense before rebutting it. but most skeptics haven't even constructed an alternative narrative.
Well, they take this on and take this on and this on. I'm not going to do an overarching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's not actually an alternative theory, and oftentimes we see that conspiracy theorists will believe in multiple simultaneous conflicting conspiracies, right? and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But you can only do that if you don't actually posit a really coherent conspiracy theory. If your whole goal is to poke holes in the traditional narrative rather than providing a plausible alternative.
I'm glad you came up with a narrative.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. It wasn't easy. It took a lot. I had to talk to several of my conspiracy theorist friends and kind of weave it together and like take pieces from what they were saying and kind of create something.
Did you run this by them first or no?
Not the final version, but I got
so they'll see it here first.
Yeah, they'll see it here first. Another question is whether it's logically consistent. You have to ask, is what's being presented, is this logically consistent? Does it utilize circular reasoning? Does it contradict itself? Often the same conspiracy theorists will, like I said, believe in contradictory pieces of evidence or contradictory theories, right? So an example is like in Princess Diana's death, people often believed that Princess Diana faked her own death and is still alive. Or
Elvis too?
That Princess Diana was murdered.
She's hanging out with Elvis? Who works for the FBI?
Oh, the CIA. Princess Diana was also considered to be murdered in a plot orchestrated by the British royal family, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, like, there's these two conflicting theories, and often people will believe either or both, or just like whichever one makes the most sense for the situation. They're not sure which one, but definitely one of those, right? It's the idea that like, we don't know exactly what happened, but definitely the mainstream narrative is not the truth, right? So one of these other things, right? Another example is the COVID-19 crisis. So some people will say the virus was created and spread intentionally by powerful groups to control the population. And the same people will also say the virus is a hoax and didn't even exist, right? So these are completely contradictory. You have to choose. But mainly the point is we don't believe the mainstream narrative, right? We believe something else. We're not sure what, but it could be this, could be that.
Throw spaghetti against the wall.
Well, like I said earlier, like one example that we could use in Brigham Young's life is that he was an awful libidinous, power-hungry person who used polygamy to satisfy those desires, or maybe simultaneously, who knows? He was a sincere believer who received an independent revelation. Maybe an angel of darkness came to him with a drawn sword, and maybe that narrative came about because of Brigham rather than Joseph. But Brigham was just trying to do what he thought was right for the church, and what he was just trying to follow God's will, right? Those can't both be true. They're in conflict with each other, but there's not a coherent motivation ascribed to Brigham by the skeptics. It's like, I've heard them posit both of these, and they'll say like, maybe it was either one, who knows?
Yeah.
Well, come up with
Pick
a theory.
one.
Yeah, pick one. Though, to be fair, later on, I'm going to say the same kind of thing of Joseph. Like, there isn't, like, even though we have a consistent narrative about Joseph, we don't often ascribe a lot of motivation to Joseph because we don't know what his thinking was. And I've come up with several plausible explanations for why Joseph might have instituted polygamy. And I don't legitimately know which one he was thinking when he did it. But like, just to be fair, I shouldn't hold the conspiracy theorists to a higher standard than I'm willing to hold myself, right? I also don't know Joseph's potential motivations. Sometimes conspiracy theories are not coherent or fully fleshed out. So like in the chemtrails theory, they'll see these white contrails or chemical trails following an airplane, and they'll say that they're like chemical or biological agents that are meant for either weather modification, mind control, population control, biological warfare, agricultural control, or pharmaceutical testing. Like, who knows what they are?
All the above.
But they're definitely not just ice crystals high up in the atmosphere freezing quickly. Like, definitely not that. So, like, if you don't have a coherent, fleshed out narrative, then you have to look at the Brigham Young theory and ask the same question. When skeptics say, they'll often say in podcasts, it strains credulity or it strains the imagination. And I have to say, like, you don't have much of an imagination. I can imagine a lot of reasons why this might have happened, right? But like that's the main point. It's not to flesh out an alternative narrative. It's just to poke holes in other people's.
Right.
Proponents often get away with this because they just raise unanswered questions rather than making concrete assertions themselves. So an example of this is like in the 9/11 truth movement, they just ask a bunch of questions that are unanswered. They don't try to incorporate them into a coherent narrative. They just say like, why did the World Trade Center buildings include World Trade Center 7, which was not directly hit by a plane, but it still collapsed in a manner resembling controlled demolitions? Why is there a lack of clear photographic or video evidence of the plane hitting the Pentagon? And why did the impact site show relatively little debris compared to other plane crashes? So they just raise questions. They don't posit a particular explanation, but the implication here is that these questions reflect just like a suspicion of the mainstream narrative. They hint at potential foreknowledge and complicity or conspiracy, but they're not positing a particular narrative. And the same thing is happening in the Brigham Young conspiracy theory, where they'll say like, well, what about Joseph's character? He didn't behave like other polygamous cult leaders. I've heard somebody say that. Well, I mean, fair. Like, you're right. He doesn't seem to be as power hungry as some other people. He doesn't seem to be as abusive or manipulating as some other people were.
Depends on your point of view.
Yeah, it depends on your point of view. And also, even if you have a charitable point of view like I do, you can still see that there were narcissistic tendencies. And there was kind of maybe an obliviousness towards the potential consequences of this practice. And so like there are answers to those kinds of questions, but they might also ask like, what about scripture that promotes monogamy? Why did Joseph consistently deny polygamous wives? Well, like, there are potential answers to those questions, but they're not proposing good answers to those questions. They're just raising a bunch of questions and not giving an alternative theory. Okay, another question we have to ask is about falsifiability. Is the theory even falsifiable? Is there any evidence that could prove it false? Right? In this case, in the case of the Brigham Young theory, not really, because every piece of evidence that seems to prove the theory false is just further evidence of the conspiracy, right? It's just taken as, well, that was fabricated. That's a later coercion. That's a later misrecollection or whatever, right? An example of this is Martha Brotherton gave a contemporary 1842 affidavit that Joseph Smith was involved in introducing her to polygamy. So Brigham Young, brought her aside first and tried to induct her. She wasn't buying it. So Brigham goes and he gets Joseph and brings him in to kind of help with this situation, right? To help convince Martha. Martha Brotherton still isn't having it, right? And so she later goes and she's signing an affidavit to kind of be an expose against the Mormons, right? Well, when some skeptics view this evidence that Joseph was implicated, they'll say, for example, that Martha was blind and couldn't see who came Maybe she inferred it was Joseph, but it was just an actor. Or maybe Martha didn't know who Joseph Smith was. And so when Joseph was brought into the room and Brigham said, or when an actor was brought into the room and Brigham said, "This is Joseph," and it wasn't really Joseph, Martha couldn't discern that. So these are the kinds of contrary explanations that are used to dismiss any contrary evidence, however implausible these explanations seem. It's the same kind of logic that oftentimes apologists will use. That's like, this is not impossible. So as long as it opens like a fraction of just the barest door of, just the barest crack in the door, then like we're good because we can still keep believing this, this thing. If it's incredulous, then it should be incredulous. We should treat it as incredulous, right?
Unless it helps our theory.
Another question that you should ask of conspiracy theories is, what is the scope and scale required in order to pull this off? Right? So an example from...
How did Brigham Young get William Marks on his side? That's what I want to know.
Right? Yeah, it seems really implausible, right?
Yeah.
So even if we dismiss William Marks, you still have to, even if you just accept the narrative of the 12, you still have to say Brigham, Heber, Willard Richards, Orson Pratt, John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, William Clayton, W. Phelps, and maybe others, and many women are all in on this conspiracy in some way or another. They're either deluded or they're in on it.
Eliza Snow.
And yeah, exactly. And, apparently all the women who signed affidavits,
right.
I understand that the argument is not actually that they were all in on the conspiracy. The argument is more that they were coerced, but like it requires just a shocking level of involvement and nobody ever saying otherwise. Nobody ever saying like, I was strong-armed into signing this. Nobody ever saying like, even if they defected in Nauvoo or in Utah, even if we find other examples where women will write in their personal journals that they hate polygamy, but they'll never admit in their journals that like somebody forced them to say that they were involved in polygamy. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like if you're free enough to say you hate polygamy, then you should be free enough to tell the truth about other things. So if you're not finding the truth told about Joseph's involvement, then you have to question. Then you have to question, why isn't that being shared? Is it maybe just because the traditional narrative is accurate? The more people that are involved in a conspiracy theory, of course, the less likely it is to be true because they would have to consistently not disclose, not be, there would have to be no whistleblowers, anything like that. So an example of that is like the Watergate and Pentagon Papers were eventually blown because insiders leaked information to the press, right? So in most cases, when a conspiracy is uncovered, it's because there's some kind of whistleblower. But the fact that there was never any whistleblower in this situation, there's no evidence anywhere of anybody conspiring or suggesting that that they were coerced to conspire. That suggests that it's very unlikely to be a legitimate conspiracy. There's also this phenomenon of duper's delight.
Duper's
delight. If you dupe somebody, if you trick them, if you're a liar and you successfully pull off your lie, you love it. Psychologically, you can't help but grin at the thought. Like there's like this secret duper's delight smile. If you tell a lie, you like secretly, like you can't help but exhibit the micro expression of a little smile while lying. And people will often disclose later, they'll brag about the lies that they've told, right? They'll brag about how like they pulled one over on so-and-so.
Well, I mean, a counter narrative is Mark still hasn't told, Mark Hoffman.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So that's strange. It certainly seems odd that he wouldn't be a little braggadocious about his conspiracy. He wants to be known as
the best forger, so he can't share his secrets.
Yeah.
A magician doesn't tell his secrets.
Yeah. Well, oftentimes we see that people will brag about these kinds of things. So we see oftentimes we find Trump's recordings about nefarious things that he's done and the lies that he's told and the fact that he knows that he's telling lies and he's really proud of this, right?
But I could have declassified this when I was president.
Yes.
But I'm showing you right now on tape.
So we see that kind of thing. And then you have to wonder, if nobody ever, What do you hear much later in the later journals about polygamy? Later journals, recollections, letters, reports. You hear juicy gossip. You don't hear you hear juicy gossip about Joseph's involvement, things that Joseph did, like the Abrahamic test that he exerted on Heber to give up his wife Valete to him, right? To Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
He made Heber commit that he was going to give his wife to Joseph, and Heber fasted and prayed for 3 days and eventually relented and decided to give her to Joseph. And Joseph, in this late recollection, says, "Oh, it was just a test and you passed. Good job," right? That's the kind of salacious gossip you hear later down the road. You never hear salacious gossip about the conspiracy, right? You never hear about something Brigham did, some nefarious and awful thing that Brigham did. But you would expect if somebody really were involved in a conspiracy theory, if they were involved in a legitimate conspiracy, you would expect for that Duper's delight to come out. That kind of late recollection would be the juicy gossip about when I pulled one over on the saints, right? That's the kind of thing you'd expect to hear. You have to ask, is there a reason to believe that large numbers of conspirators would stay quiet about any given conspiracy? And legitimately, all the women seem to have reasons for not talking a lot about Joseph's involvement. Like most women didn't ever end up saying much of anything about it. And they didn't deny their affidavits that they signed, but they didn't expound on the relationship that they have with Joseph. Fanny Alger gives the best quote here. She says, when she's asked about a relationship with Joseph, "That is all a matter of my own, and I have nothing to communicate." Like, mind your own business, right? It seems like most of Joseph's wives felt the same way. They kind of took this mum's approach. They kept their mouth shut about it. They said what they needed to when they were asked in affidavits or in a court trial, but rarely gossiped about it, rarely told about it, which suggests either that they experienced a lot of trauma from that, or that they felt it was very sacred. And either one of those explanations,
or both,
yeah. But either one or both of those explanations could potentially account for why people would keep quiet about it. But there's not similar explanations for why people would always keep quiet about a conspiracy involving Brigham, right? Because once Brigham dies, or once people, if people defect and leave Utah, or if they defect from the church, they don't feel that same loyalty. Why wouldn't they share, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to ask the question, what is the simplest explanation? Is there a simpler explanation than the one you're positing? What's Occam's razor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to look for this parsimony, or this, just whatever makes really the most logical sense. So the most common example for mainstream conspiracy theories is the explanation of incompetence. People are often ascribing this convoluted network of conspiring to make something happen, when really the best explanation is that it just happened, and everybody's just generally incompetent at their jobs or at pulling something off, right? So an example is the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was on the other side of the Pentagon during the 9/11 attacks. And so people would say he was complicit. That was evidence that he knew it was coming, and he went to the... But if he really knew it was coming,
part of the building,
would you come to work that day? You wouldn't go to the other side of the building. You just wouldn't come in, right? So that's not the most. That's not a parsimonious explanation. There are better, simpler explanations. He was just there at work, right? That's where he would be on a normal day anyway. People don't account for the fact that, why was he on the other side of the Pentagon? He was in his office.
Where he was supposed to be.
That's where he is always. But another theory that's put forward about that is that he needed secret documents destroyed, and so he conspired with the Al-Qaeda to crash into the building to destroy If you need documents destroyed, what about a shredder? There are simpler explanations here, right?
Right.
So you could do the same thing with so many of the polygamy conspiracy arguments about Brigham Young. Jacob 2, for example, has been reinterpreted now to mean the opposite of what it historically has meant. So people look at this exception verse and they say if I will raise up seed unto myself, then I will command otherwise. But if not, then you just keep these commandments, right? That has historically been interpreted to mean you should be monogamous unless I tell you otherwise. But people have recently parsed the words differently in the sentences, and they've begun to say, well, these sentences don't mean what we used to think they mean. They actually say, if you're unrighteous, then you're going to fall into polygamy. But otherwise, if you don't, then I'll be able to raise up righteous seed, that kind of thing. So they reinterpret, and it's a potentially valid way of interpreting the verse. There's nothing wrong with that way of parsing. But it's not the simpler way. If it was the simpler, more obvious way, then people would have known that all along. But if you have to go through a convoluted contrival of interpretation to get to that conclusion, then it's not the simplest explanation. That's not Occam's razor, right? I'm not saying that you've parsed the verse wrong now. Maybe it was always meant to be read that way, but it's certainly not the most obvious parsimonious explanation. Similarly, the explosion of the number of wives involved in polygamy after Joseph's death has been interpreted as evidence that Joseph had been blocking the practice. And as soon as he's out of the way, then everybody's able to do it freely like they'd always wanted to, right? But another possible explanation is that, let's say that Joseph theory is right and he really did practice polygamy. That would mean that he was martyred for the principle, martyred because he practiced polygamy. And he admits that in that Marx quote we read earlier, where he says, Marx relays Joseph as saying, I will go to the slaughter for my own crimes because of polygamy, right? Because I instituted, that's the reason why people hate me right now, and I'm going to be tried for this. So if he was martyred for the principle, the apostles would presumably feel emboldened by the martyrdom, that this is a principle worth dying for. This is something we have to keep alive at all costs. Let's do it more. Let's spread it. Let's make sure it doesn't die out. So the 12 and maybe others want to further instantiate that practice, build it as part of Joseph's legacy. And also, since they're preparing for this trek west, they know that this vision of a heavenly net that captures all people and seals everybody together. You don't want anybody left out of that before you go. So you make sure that everybody is sealed to a spouse before you leave. So this is a perfectly logical explanation for the enormous rise in the number of wives in the few years subsequent, or in the few years following Joseph's death, right? Mm-hmm. Which one's simpler? You have to. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say. Depends on which perspective you adopt. But one reasonable explanation seems to be that there was a legacy there worth living. Brigham Young claims to have had a polygamy revelation before Joseph revealed it to him. He says, when I was in England, I had some notion about this given to me by the Spirit. I didn't understand it at that time, but then later, when I went and Joseph explained it to me, then it all made sense, right? So he kind of explains that. He also has those apparent affairs in England before Joseph revealed polygamy to him, and these two things are taken as evidence that Brigham Young started polygamy. But there are alternative explanations, right? Simpler, parsimonious explanations. One is that Joseph may have mentioned at some point prior the need to restore plural marriage as part of a restoration of all things. Some people say that the earliest notion of polygamy in Joseph's mind seems to be hinted at in 1831. Mm-hmm. So if that really happened, and if Joseph really did dabble a little bit in polygamy with Fanny Alger, transpose that
Fanny
there. If Joseph really had been dabbling, there's every possibility that he might have mentioned it to Brigham, and maybe Brigham did take some liberties that he shouldn't have taken before. But it's possible that Joseph planted ideas that kind of ruminated in Brigham's mind, right? That doesn't mean that Brigham just got it ex nihilo. Brigham also may have given the idea to Joseph after visiting the Cochranites, and Joseph may have adopted it to the church, like we talked about earlier, among this idea of general syncretism, kind of adopting everything else in the zeitgeist.
I'm going to start looking for evidence that Joseph was a Cochranite. What would that do to their theory? That would blow it up, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know. They'd explain it some other way.
I don't even think, I see your point, but even if there's no evidence that Joseph spent time among the Cochranites, or that he was exposed to directly to Cochranite theory, if he heard it secondhand through the 12 who had been in Maine, that's all that's required in order for Joseph to adopt the approach as part of his general syncretism, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, if it's in the air, Joseph will grab it. That's just kind of his approach. And then finally, if polygamy was really inspired by God, Brigham Young could have received the very revelation he claims to have received about the principle in England. That's completely consistent with the traditional narrative that Joseph Smith instituted polygamy. Well, maybe Brigham also had a polygamy revelation that he didn't understand and that later was explained further to him, right? So I think that's way more parsimonious than that he was the one who started polygamy and he was just kind of accidentally revealing that or something.
Yeah.
Oh, we should talk about the children. One of the best evidences that the conspiracy theorists will posit for in support of Brigham Young's having started it is that the DNA tests have confirmed that there are no polygamous children born to Joseph Smith. They say Emma was pregnant every 2 years. She bore 9 children to Joseph. Why didn't any other plural wives bear any children? And again, I think that's a reasonable explanation. I think that's a reasonable question.
To me, it's their best
argument. I think it's very strong. I think it's probably, honestly, the most parsimonious explanation for the data that maybe Joseph wasn't involved in sexual relationships. But I think that there are other almost equally plausible explanations. Like, as we saw, Sylvia Porter Sessions believed that Joseph was the father of her daughter. Even if the DNA didn't support that, then we'd have to say, maybe she was having simultaneous relations with both her legal husband and with Joseph. And Meg Stout writes a book, Joseph Smith, Reluctant Polygamist, where she outlines this argument that Joseph Smith didn't really like polygamy. He didn't want to do it, but he felt compelled by heaven to do it. And if that was true, if Joseph really did feel that, and the evidence seems to suggest, as Meg outlines there, that he may have had very limited and infrequent conjugal relations, resulting in no children. Because if he didn't really like the idea of polygamy, he might have done it out of obedience, but rarely consummated it. Maybe only with a few of his wives, maybe none at all. It's impossible to say.
Maybe just Sylvia.
maybe just Sylvia. It's really difficult to say, but I think. I will grant.
And Fanny, I think we got pretty good evidence for Fanny and Sylvia.
I guess Fanny's an interesting one because when Oliver accuses Joseph of adultery, of having an affair, Joseph says, "Did I ever tell you it was adultery?" And Oliver's like, "No, I guess you never admitted to that. You didn't say those words." And Joseph's like, "See?" And then the 12 are like, "Okay." Or the high counsel's like, "All right, if he didn't say it was adultery." So the thing is, like, this perhaps is not the most parsimonious explanation, but it does seem the most consistent with the quotes that Joseph is saying. And so it seems the most consistent with Joseph's own mindset is that Joseph is engaging in these kinds of relationships, but he doesn't think of them as illicit. He doesn't think of them as unsanctioned. He thinks of them as sacred, beautiful, as authorized by God. And as long as he's authorized by God, then it's okay. And so it's not adultery. You can't pin me down to that.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Another question we have to ask is the motives. What is the purported motive behind the conspiracy theory? Who would benefit from it? Why would they end up doing this thing you're accusing them of? And sometimes that question isn't really that helpful because it's so integral to the theory that it's just really obvious. Like an example of that would be like the U.S. contriving the moon landing. Like the obvious reason why they would do that is because they were in a race with Russia, and if they won that race, then even by false pretense, then they would get the credit. They would win the social war. It's not about the space war; it's about the social war between those countries. So that's like an obvious one. Obama, the birther Obama theory, like obviously if Obama was able to pull this off, then he would be able to be the president. So the motivation is like embedded in the theory. It's not a helpful question. 50
years.
But there are situations where the motive is not very clear. And so you have to kind of dig into this a little bit and understand why do they think that somebody would be engaging in this? Like, for example, flat earthers don't have a very good motive for people to like be conspiring, so all the scientists of the world to be conspiring about a spherical earth. So their purported motivations are that they can control people more easily if you control their worldview. Oh, pun intended. They also say like this is potentially NASA boondoggle. Like NASA's just like
just getting money.
Just like as long as we like keep up this, just keep up this spherical world model, then we can keep doing like space exploration, and to stop all of us from learning what's beyond the Arctic, because the Arctic purportedly would then like be the edge of the Earth, right? In the flat Earth model, that would be that's
Russia's beyond the Arctic.
So then you'll have to say, well, what's beyond the Arctic? And that's the motivation for stopping us all from knowing that there's really a flat Earth. But those are absurd motivations, right? And so if you dig into that, you start to see like that undermines the credibility of that conspiracy theory quite substantially. Well, if you ask the question about Brigham Young, one potential answer is, of course, that he would be motivated for sex, but there are way easier ways for him to do this, including a brothel in Nauvoo next to the temple. Did you know that? I just learned recently that there was a brothel in Nauvoo. I'm sorry, but if illicit sex is that readily available, you don't need to like contrive some widespread conspiracy theory in order to engage in this, right? Like just go get you some. What if it's out of sincere belief, like some have posited? Then if that were true, then Joseph's private denunciations would have stopped Brigham and others from engaging in this, right? If Joseph privately said, you guys got to knock this off, then they would have stopped, right? Mm-hmm. So that I feel like that falls apart as a potential narrative, as a potential motivation. What about if it's for power? Like you're consolidating power through like intermarriage networks of like, everybody's related to you. So in fact, there was a dissertation I once read, I think it was by a scholar of history graduating from the University of Utah, who did like some kind of statistical map analysis. It was like a connectome, a connection analysis that was showing like the number of the depth of integration that Brigham Young had compared to other conspiracy theorists, mm-hmm. and that allowed him to be the rightful successor, the successful successor to Joseph after the fact, because he was the most related to other people. He had the most influence. Maritally, right, compared to mm-hmm. any of the other successors.
I think I heard about that paper.
Yeah. But if you start to dig into that motivation a little bit deeper, then you start to see that even though it's probably the most plausible of these other motivations, it's not actually that plausible, because there are so many easier ways to consolidate power within even the Mormon movement. Like, why not do what Strang did and like move to somewhere civilized? Why did you bring them all the way out to Utah? Like, you don't have to bring people all the way out into the middle of nowhere in order to like isolate your influence. You can just move to Beaver Island,
he did end up Beaver Island, which is basically empty.
Yeah. Well, it was basically empty, but it was still very close to civilization. You could still ride a boat and get supplies from other people. Like you still have a lot of control, but you don't have to sacrifice all of your worldly niceties, right? Mm-hmm. Well, another thought there is the move to Utah is interpreted as Brigham trying to isolate that power and get the saints under his control. But Joseph had already, in the Council of 50 Minutes, scholars have found that Joseph was already instigating the search for a place to move out of the United States, presumably because of polygamy. but if he's already sending out scouts to look at Mexico, what's today called Mexico and what is today Utah, and other potential settlement sites.
Well, Wisconsin and Texas, Oregon.
Yeah. Then you have to say, well, that wasn't Brigham's idea. Brigham wasn't the one who instigated the move to Utah. That was already underway. That was just a legacy of Joseph's that Brigham chose to enact after mm-hmm. Joseph's death, right? So the power motivation also starts to fall apart if you investigate it a little. Another question we can ask is the precedent. Is there historical precedent for this type of conspiracy? So like in the mainstream conspiracy theory the field of mainstream conspiracy theories. The Watergate scandal was a legitimate conspiracy that allowed people in the wake of the October surprise in 1980. Are you familiar with that one, the October surprise? This is a similar scandal to Watergate. It was where representatives of Ronald Reagan's campaign secretly negotiated with, or were purported to secretly negotiate with Iranian officials to delay the release of 52 American hostages until after the presidential election. Well, that kind of conspiracy becomes more plausible in light of the Watergate scandal, right? But it's not, like, even though the further evidence didn't uncover it, it lends further credibility to that kind of conspiracy theory, right? So we have to ask the same kind of question with Brigham Young. Were there other conspiracies like Brigham's proposed conspiracy that were successfully pulled off? Well, one could point to people like Jim Jones, Charles Manson, David Koresh, who used sexual relationships to strengthen and maintain control in isolated groups. So that immediately suggests that maybe Brigham did the same, like that's happened before or since. However, no similar cult has lasted like Brigham's. Like, Brigham's became an institutionalized church that's lasted for 200 years, and these other cults fizzled out often in mass suicide or awful circumstances. After just between one was 2 years, 12 years, 24 years, whatever it was, right? But like within a relatively short period of time, their power got to their head. It corrupted the people. It broke apart the group. The cult couldn't survive because the sexual manipulation that was being engaged in didn't last, right? So it's possible that Brigham Young could have pulled off something differently than them, but other conspiracies that have happened in a similar way didn't carry forward with the same kind of historical trajectory that Brigham's purportedly did. Also, I feel like Brigham was too good to be that bad. Like, he taught so many. Some people have said that, and I can't see it when I look at his speeches. Like some of the Brigham said a lot, admittedly. Like, he said a lot of garbage, and a lot of it was bad. Like, I don't want to like glorify Brigham. I'm really impressed by his civil engineering. I'm impressed by his like social psychology skills, his ability to understand groups of people and manipulate them into doing what he wanted them to do. I'm impressed by the legacy that he built in the Utah Territory. I think it's really impressive what he did. I think he was pretty authoritarian at times. I think he has a very mixed legacy. However, I think if you look at the things he taught over the pulpit, the talks he gave, the things he said, admittedly, there's a mixed bag there. There's some weird stuff in the mix, but there's so much good, so much leading towards Zionic ideals, and so much attempts to like get people to care for each other and love each other and be good and righteous people that I can't. I'm not seeing similar kinds of motivations and mentalities in other similar cult leaders, right? And this is the same. Polygamy skeptics have said the same of Joseph Smith. Like, I don't see Joseph as similar to other cult leaders. Fair, but I don't see Brigham the same way either. Like, Brigham also wasn't like other sexual predator cult leaders, right? So I don't know. I don't see the precedents being particularly plausible. And then I'm really nearing done. So so you have to ask, what do forensic experts say? So almost invariably, when a conspiracy theory comes to light, investigative journalists, like I've said, or other scientists or experts, historians, whoever, will look into the evidence and they will draw conclusions. This might be judicial court proceedings or forensic accountants or all kinds of people who will like look into the theory and try to figure out its veracity. All of those are, of course, subject to some degree of bias, but they're less biased than what an ordinary person like you and I will engage in without the substantial advanced training in forensic work that people like that have. So the reason why theirs is better than ours, generally speaking, is because they have certain standards of evidence, standardized procedures, and oversight, like ethics boards and review boards and ethics committees and things like that, that help guide the conduction of their work. Whereas like lone conspiracy theorists out there on the internet have no such thing, right? They don't have particular guidelines. They don't have oversight. They don't have standards of evidence. They don't have standardized procedures for evaluating the evidence. None of that stuff, right? So then we have to ask the question, what's going on in this field of polygamy history within Mormon science? And we see that unfortunately neither side has a strong claim to having like strong historians on their side. Like a lot of the people who are the most preeminent in doing the scholarly work of polygamy history are amateur historians. And skeptics will often point to that and criticize, like, these are not professional historians. But neither are the skeptics. So neither group has a very strong claim to the kind of authority that comes from expertise, from being a forensic expert, right? Of course, there are more historians, legitimate historians with PhDs in history, who side on I think virtually all, maybe all historians side on the side of the traditional narrative as opposed to the conspiracy theory.
I don't know any skeptics that have a PhD in history.
Yeah, I don't either. I know some that have a PhD, but not in history, which goes back to the idea of you can be an expert in a field and still not be equipped to evaluate a conspiracy theory in a different field, right?
Right.
So like I have a PhD in psychology and I'm able to talk about the psychology of conspiracy theories, but I'm not actually that equipped to address the issues of this particular conspiracy theory. So at the end of the day, I really ought to look at what the forensic experts say, what the academic historians say about this. And almost all of them agree that, or maybe legitimately all of them.
I would argue all of them.
That agree with the traditional narrative.
Well, and it's funny to me because I've given this challenge several times.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody so far has taken me up on it. But I'm like, go take some history classes, publish in a peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah.
I do know one person who made an attempt, but that hasn't panned out yet. And we'll see what happens. But, there's not one PhD trained historian who says Joseph fought polygamy. There are some former RLDS members who say that, but they're not historians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So the last thing I wanted to share, this is just nearing the end here. I feel like if you want to seriously inquire yourself, if you want to interrogate your own assumptions really well about this, and you want to really be intellectually honest with yourself about the Brigham Young versus Joseph Smith conspiracy, then you have to consider alternative theories of Joseph's polygamy that might account for the data better than your conspiracy theory. And I'm not seeing that a lot of people have seriously considered the breadth and depth of all the ways in which Joseph might have done this with different motivations, in different mindsets, with different statuses as prophet. So I would like to just posit like a few options that maybe people haven't considered that might better allow us to account for what we're observing in the data than the traditional narrative, which suggests that Joseph instituted this just as a true prophet, and did God's will, but later on God changed his mind or something like that, right? Like
okay.
It's not entirely clear in our mainstream narrative like why it was rescinded, if it was just political or if really God like had fulfilled his purpose.
It was political.
Yeah. Okay, so Joseph's role could have been, at this time, a true prophet, a false prophet, a flawed prophet, a fallen prophet, or a psychologically damaged prophet or non-prophet, right? Any of those statuses as prophet would have allowed him to embark in polygamy with different outcomes, different motivations, different sanctions by God.
And I know people who will argue all of those.
Yes. We have to consider Joseph's potential attitude about it. Some people have argued that he was reluctant about it. Some people enthusiastic about it. Some people that it was holy. Some that it was lecherous. Some that he was power hungry. Some that he was egalitarian, right? So there's lots of potential explanations for what Joseph was thinking, what his motivations were, what was going on in his head about it. right? And then also, there are lots of explanations for possible things that Joseph believed about God's purpose in instituting polygamy. There could have been tons of reasons why God, in Joseph's mind, would have wanted polygamy to be instituted. One could be, as has been posited, the restoration of all Old Testament practices. One could be that it was an Abrahamic test for the people to see if they would be willing to obey God. One could be a way to wean people off of societal norms and to train them to put God's will above all else. I think, who was your recent interview with? The polygamist in AUB?
Josh Thompson.
Yeah, Josh Thompson. Yeah, he suggested something that sounded very much like that. He said, this is a holy principle. If people will actually give it a serious go, you will find that it will wreck you. It will turn you inside out. It will ruin you. And then you will find that you are able to be rebuilt in God's image because you are no more. Your desires, your compunctions, they've been done away with, and that is done in a unique way in the practice of polygamy. So that could be one thing that Joseph understood might occur because of that. It could be an answer to imbalanced gender ratios, either on earth or in heaven, right? So just a logistical issue. We just have too many women. We need them to marry somebody.
I don't think that's ever been a problem. Brian Hales kind of refuted that.
Yes, many people have refuted that, and that's partly the skeptics. The skeptics have argued that that's not a legitimate argument, right?
I don't know anybody.
But here's the.
There have been some apologetic arguments for that, but it doesn't.
But here's the problem. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It matters if Joseph believed that was true. Joseph could have thought that was a legitimate solution. He could have thought, for example, that you will bear more children in polygamous marriages than in monogamous marriages. And if he thought that, then he could institute polygamy. It's not about whether it actually works, right? It's about what Joseph believed it worked, right?
Okay.
So that could have been one of Joseph's motivations, even if it's not true, even if it doesn't work. It could have been a mechanism to raise up righteous seed, though that seems suspect given that, Clayton got in trouble for impregnating one of his plural wives. So that seems, maybe seed wasn't that wasn't the issue. It could be a mechanism to seal up unto salvation as many people as possible. Just like we have to get everybody sealed into this big net, and that's just the way we do it. It could have been a command for a specific time with a specific purpose. It could have been a command that God intended for this entire dispensation, and we blew it, like the AUB thing. And those aren't all mutually exclusive. Some of those explanations, or maybe multiple of those explanations, were going around in Joseph's head, right? But the fact of the matter is, there are legitimate, plausible, parsimonious explanations for what was going on in Joseph's head and heart, for his status as a prophet, that are much more credible than what we're seeing coming out of the Brigham Young conspiracy theory. And we have to seriously wrestle with that if we're gonna choose to believe in the Brigham Young conspiracy theory, because it's not the most parsimonious explanation on most counts for most evidence.
I agree.
Yeah. So that's it. Phew.
Wow, that was pretty comprehensive.
It took so much work to kind of pull this together. Months and months and months. You remember I messaged you about maybe doing this back in the summer.
Yeah.
I've been working on this for the last 6 months, trying to make sense of things. And really, a lot of the work came together in this last month, but I have been kind of listening to the podcast, listening to both sides, trying to suss out the evidence, trying to get to the bottom of things, looking at the provenance myself. I've put in so many hours and so much work into this. And at the end of the day, I just have to conclude the traditional narrative is just a lot better. Yeah, it's a lot more trustworthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Jesse James, that was awesome. Are you going to publish this in a journal?
Oh,
MHA, no. Whitner? No?
No way, no.
Oh, come on.
It's too much work.
Well, you've already done the
work. Well, that's very thoughtful of you. I will have to consider that.
Please do. You're too late for MHA, but I think Whitmer in the fall, although you'll probably have to condense it to 20 minutes. And we've been going over 4 hours, so you've got a lot of condensing there.
I'm sorry to listeners. I'm just really sorry.
All right. Well, thanks for being here on Gospel Tangents. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Jesse James. Jesse, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It was a super fun conversation, and I hope everybody learned the psychology behind conspiracy theories. Thanks again. We're going to stick with the social science arena, and this time we're going to talk to Dr. Ryan Cragen from the University of Tampa about his new book, Goodbye Religion.
I wanted to write a book specifically focused on people leaving religion and like why. Why do they leave? What happens to them? Where do they go? There were a lot of papers on this, right? So lots of different papers, book chapters, a lot of stuff on this. But I was kind of thinking, one, we could provide a good theoretical framework, so we'll probably talk about that. But I also wanted it to kind of be like the definitive book. Like this is going to be the book that everybody can be like, oh, well, what does the research say on why people are leaving religion in the U.S.? It's U.S. based.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.